Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of Ask an Atheist. I am Andrew Seidel, the Director of Strategic Response here at the Freedom from Religion Foundation.
And I'm Dante Harootunian, the Patrick O'Reilly Legal Fellow at the Freedom from Religion Foundation. This week on FFRF's Ask an Atheist, we'll be speaking with Andrew Fiala, a professor at Fresno State University. He recently wrote an interesting op-ed in the Fresno Bee on how COVID-19 is illustrating the chasm between the religious and the free-thinking community. If you would like to read it now, you can go to the link that should be on your screen and check it out.
Yeah, right there, ffrf.us/Fiala. That's Fiala. And we'll be talking with Dr. Fiala in just a minute. But first, we're going to run down a few of the big news items this week. And as always, if you've got questions or comments about today's show, feel free to leave them right here in the comments on Facebook. Or if you've got a question, you can email it to askanatheist@ffrf.org. That's askanatheist@ffrf.org, or ask it right here in the comments. And we are going to be asking those questions of our guests later, too. So, Dante, you've got some kind of big news this week, and I think we ought to share it with everybody. So tell us about it.
Yes, we just won a victory in Effingham, Illinois. You might remember a few months ago that we wrote a letter to the city there asking that they remove a large Latin cross that had been painted on a mural at a high school in the city. And this week,
and there it is up on the screen for everybody. Yeah, just let her see it right there on the screen. I mean, it was pretty brazen, pretty bold right out there.
Yes, well, the mural consisted, as I'm sure our viewers can see, just of the American flag and the Latin cross. It's the same sort of energy we fear that went behind putting God on the money, God in the pledge, that it tries to tie together patriotism and religiosity, or nationalism and religiosity. But this week we found out that the cross has been painted over, and the city released a statement saying in part that the last thing the city council wants is for any members of our community to feel excluded or treated as second-class citizens because they hold a minority belief. It is in service to these principles that the city council has altered the mural accordingly. So that was good to hear, and we're happy that the issue has been resolved.
Yeah, that's a great win. And I really appreciate the way the city justified it because, Christian nationalism really is about elevating Christians to a special favored class and making everybody else these second-class citizens. And a mural that the government puts up that just shows the American flag and the Latin cross really does a good job of elevating Christians to that status. And so the city's saying that we don't want members to feel excluded or treated as second-class citizens really hits exactly the concern that FFRF was raising. And I think it's great for everybody to know, too, that we've done a ton of work here at the Freedom from Religion Foundation on this pandemic, making sure that stay-at-home rules apply to churches, talking to governors and local and city and state and county governments about extending stay-at-home orders to churches, dealing with all manner of new violations of state-church separation that we didn't even know existed before this pandemic. But we're also still dealing with all of these old bread and butter issues and complaints that we got at the Freedom from Religion Foundation and still working to defend that wall. And this is just a great example of one of the victories that we had, and we actually have visual evidence of it. So really great win, and congratulations, Dante, and to our brave local complainants down in Effingham who reported this.
Yes. And I believe you have some news to share as well.
A little bit. I mean, I think people probably are familiar with some of this, but since the last show, we did some research at FFRF. Mostly Annie Laurie Gaylor, our co-president, headed this up. And we put up an analysis of about 19 lawsuits that churches or churchgoers, worshipers, have filed against government officials over the shutdown. And we've summarized that data, and it's clear that church services and rituals are providing this unique breeding ground for COVID-19, perhaps because of, communal holy water or passing the basket to donate or sharing Bibles. And so we've seen churches helping spread the virus. I mean, in South Korea, for instance, 60% of all cases trace back to one church cluster. one worshiper attended 2 services and infected 1,200 people. In Butte County, California, one COVID-19 positive worshiper attended a Mother's Day church service and exposed 180 other people to the deadly contagion. In Sacramento, Sacramento County, excuse me, 1/3 of the cases are tied to church services. So clearly there is this tie. And FFRF has a list of all those different states and lawsuits. You scroll across the screen and you can find more information on that at our website. But the big news, of course, was on Friday at the end of the day, on the eve of this long Memorial Day weekend, President Trump called a last-minute press conference and made this announcement.
Today I'm identifying houses of worship, churches, synagogue, and mosques as essential places that provide essential services. Some governors have deemed liquor stores and abortion clinics as essential, but have left out churches and other houses of worship. It's not right. So I'm correcting this injustice and calling houses of worship essential. I call upon governors to allow our churches and places of worship to open right now. If there's any question, they're going to have to call me, but they're not going to be successful in that call. These are places that hold our society together and keep our people united. The people are demanding to go to church and synagogue, go to their mosque. Many millions of Americans embrace worship as an essential part of life. The ministers, pastors, rabbis, imams, and other faith leaders will make sure that their congregations are safe as they gather and pray. I know them well. They love their congregations. They love their people. They don't want anything bad to happen to them or to anybody else. The governors need to do the right thing and allow these very important, essential places of faith to open right now for this weekend. If they don't do it, I will override the governors. In America, we need more prayer, not less. Thank you very much. Thank you.
In America, we need more prayer, not less. So we're going to be talking with our guest about that in a second. I just want to say a couple things on this. The first is that the president does not actually have the power to just open churches and override the governors. He actually needs to either do that all the way across the board or not just as it applies to houses of worship and churches. Treating houses of worship and churches specially, singling them out for special treatment, actually violates the Constitution. That's what we do at FFRF, work to stop those violations. And finally, I mean, I think it's pretty clear, especially if you listen to that language that the president used here, that this was done for political gain. This is this is red meat that he is throwing to his base. I mean, you can see it most obviously in the two things that he said were if they were essential, liquor stores and abortion clinics. If those are essential, then churches are. I mean, that really tells you where this is coming from and the purpose behind it. This was political, nothing more. And with that, I think let's bring on our guest, Dr. Andrew Fiala. And he's the professor of philosophy and the director of the Ethics Center at Fresno State University. He's the author and editor of more than a dozen books and more than 50 scholarly articles, and he's published hundreds of op-ed essays and newspaper columns. And one of those caught our attention last week. It was in the Fresno Bee, entitled Beyond Politics, COVID-19 Pandemic Reveals the Divide Between Religious and Non-Believing. And in it, he mentioned FFRF and how we're fighting for a National Day of Reason. So, Professor, welcome to FFRF's Ask an Atheist.
Yeah, hi there. Good to be with you guys.
Thank you so much for joining us. And, I really enjoyed this article in particular because it's got history and I'm a big history nerd. Anybody who's read my one book knows that. And you talk about how pandemics have often prompted religious turmoil, you said. You talk about Athens and the Black Death. I wonder if you could give people a little bit more background if they haven't had a chance to read your article yet on that. Explain what you were going for there.
Yeah, well, it's connected to this equation that Trump made between liquor stores and churches. It turns out that in the history of pandemics, there's been two major responses. On the one hand, people say, well, since we're going to die tomorrow, we might as well get drunk and let's party. And then on the other hand, people turn to religion. So the history of both of those cases, the plague of Athens that was quite brutal, that, it killed Pericles. It was instrumental in sort of the demise of Athens and the problem of the Peloponnesian War. And Thucydides, the Greek historian, tells us that at first people went for religion to sort of solve the problem of the plague. So they prayed and they did sacrifices and whatever else. And it turned out it didn't work. And after a while, people turned away from religion, realizing that religion actually wasn't going to solve the problem. And then Thucydides tells us that sort of chaos ensued. People started partying. He says it this way. He says, there was a lack of honor and a lack of shame. And I take it what he means is people got drunk and had sex, which was a problem. So the same thing happened in the Middle Ages. And Boccaccio, the Florentine poet, he writes this very important work, the Decameron, which is about, it's situated during the plague. And he tells us something similar happened in Italy and Europe, which was that some people turned to religion, but the plague also led people away from religion. And there was a sort of Epicurean, let's party because we might die tomorrow sort of attitude. And the point about this is actually that you can see how these plagues and pandemics are really going to be important wedges in the culture wars, right? So they're going to sort of drive people one way or another. And so, this example you had with Trump today is sort of right in the ballpark on this. People, they could get liquor. I know in California you could still buy cannabis. Cannabis was viewed as essential. So why not also churches and give people the choice? You could go one way or the other.
Go ahead, Dante.
You talked about in the article not just about what happened in ancient Greece and what happened in the medieval ages with the Black Plague. You also talked about what's happening now and how you were seeing both sort of the continued long-term trend of a rise in the non-religious share of the population, as well as increased religiosity among those who remain religious. And I'm curious if you're optimistic or not about, you sort of alluded to already, the idea of political polarization and wedge issues, how when facing a pandemic, where you need buy-in sort of from a large swath of the population in order to fight it, do you think that, what path do you see for cooperation in order to make that happen, both on this issue and potentially in future issues down the road that need large segments of society to buy into the solution?
Yeah, no, this is, I'm as worried as anyone about the increased polarization in our country, especially in the last 3 or 4 years. And we see this as a huge problem with this pandemic. If we can't cooperate, then we're kind of doomed. Although I think the difference with the current situation in comparison with ancient Athens in the Middle Ages is to be blunt, we have science. And so it's science, it's reason that's actually giving us a solution to the pandemic. We know what causes it. We know how to prevent it through social distancing. We have the scientists working on a vaccine and therapies. That's quite different from the ancient world. And I think the place to find consensus, if there is such a thing in our divided culture, is going to have to be around science and reason, which was sort of what I saw the Freedom from Religion Foundation, what you were suggesting with your National Day of Reason, that was the counter-programming for the National Day of Prayer, to encourage us to go with that middle path, which is science and reason. That's, if there's going to be some hope in the place of kind of commonality, it's going to have to find itself there in the scientific medical consensus.
Absolutely. And I think that's why it's so frustrating to see science and scientific expertise and medical expertise all of a sudden become a political position. And your opinion on what the experts say all of a sudden has become an article of political faith. It's become incredibly frustrating to see that in the. I mean, it didn't seem to happen at the beginning of the pandemic. It seems to have evolved into that, which is also pretty interesting. And I just want to, for everybody who's not familiar with the National Day of Reason, it's proposed in the federal government. Jamie Raskin, a representative from Maryland, co-sponsored legislation along with Jared Huffman, Eleanor Holmes Norton, and McNerney from California to have a National Day of Reason. And it's a little frustrating because those are the only 4 members of Congress who signed on to promote reason during a pandemic out of more than 500 people. So that I think you're absolutely right, and I'm also a little alarmed that more people aren't, especially our leaders, getting on board with that, and that it's become this article of political faith.
Yeah, in my humble opinion as a philosopher, philosophy is all about reason. We need a constant reminder about the importance of critical thinking, rationality, the scientific method, making coherent arguments, avoiding ad hominem arguments. The sort of, our political discourse has really drifted in an ugly and dangerous direction. And I take it that when you're suggesting National Day of Reason, you have all of that in mind. And you also, I assume, have in mind that the sort of idea that, I don't know, God wills these things to happen, or that sort of the magical view of religion that if you just pray the disease away, somehow that's going to have an effect. There's a whole lot of background of superstition and mythology and everything from astrology and horoscopes to these supposed miracle cures for the COVID disease, like not to beat up on the president, but drinking bleach or whatever, that kind of stuff. I mean, we need evidence-based approaches to solving this pandemic, and it's then connected. You don't mind me going on just one step further. There has been a constant effort to politicize science. It's related to climate change. It's related to the anti-vax vaccination issue. It's connected, I think, even to discussions of contraception and abortion and homosexuality. I mean, there's so many of these issues that have either as a central or peripheral issue the problem of a lack of scientific understanding and lack of reason. So I salute you guys. Good. I agree with this idea that we need more reason.
Well, thank you. And we certainly agree that it is the lack of reason and the battle against reason, the war on reason, that has expanded to other areas too. And, you did mention that at the beginning of your article, that one woman who said, she wasn't afraid of the virus because it was all part of God's plan. And then there was that viral video of the woman going up to her church worship service in her car, and the interviewer from one of the local news stations asked her if she was scared, and she said, "No, I'm covered in Jesus's blood." And I think there is, you talk about magical thinking and miracle cures and praying it away. I think there is a harm in that too, in a lot of respects. And I've written about this as it applies to gun control legislation, and the thoughts and prayers. I don't necessarily think those are. I think they can be harmful in a way, because in the wake of a tragedy, or when we see something like this pandemic, we have this natural human desire to help our fellow human beings. We have empathy. And when we see a mass shooting, for instance, we want to do something to help stop that and end that pain. And if you can just pray, you get the sense that you're doing something, and that feeling goes away. And I worry about that happening here too, where there's no actual payoff for society, but people feel like they're doing something.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And I also think that the idea that somehow prayer can have that effect, and the idea that God wills these terrible things to happen, it's just bad theology from the standpoint of someone who's not a theologian, but I've talked with lots of theologians and studied, the history of religion and theology. To say that God allows this stuff to happen or wants it to happen, and then that the prayer, some sort of supplication to the arbitrary will of the divine, can have a kind of influence on this stuff, just seems to me a sad view of God. You know, God doesn't, especially with the pandemic, we know how to avoid it, right? We need social distancing, we need testing, we need to find a vaccine, and we need some therapies. That's all human agency involved. And to say that God somehow wills it or doesn't will it or allows some people to get sick or not, just totally abdicates human responsibility in all of this. And so not only is it bad theology, it's bad ethics and psychology. You know, it sort of lets people off the hook. And go back to your point about gun control, that's a similar problem, right? Rather than coming up with reasonable ideas about regulating weapons and ammunition, just throw our hands up and say, well, we can't do anything about it. Let's let God take care of it. To me, just not useful, pernicious.
Well, since you mentioned the hope that a vaccine may not necessarily be immediately on the horizon, but may eventually be developed, and you talked a little bit about the anti-vax movement earlier, are you hopeful that, I hate to call it a silver lining, but that this might remind sort of people that vaccines are the cure, that, before vaccines we had polio, we had all these horrible diseases that have sort of been forgotten in the public consciousness to an extent, that it's allowed the anti-vax movement to rise and spread, and that this might, people will see we had a virus, a vaccine was developed, hopefully, and then that will increase vaccination rates across the board later on, seeing the results of that.
Yeah, one could hope. But as we said earlier, all of this stuff now is so politicized, and these wedge issues are used to, for whatever reasons, locally and nationally, to drive people apart or into camps. And the big problem, back to this idea of a day of reason, is we need a shared set of principles, a shared methodology, and some shared understanding of what's good for us. And often that's lacking in these sort of politicized contexts, because the anti-vax movement, it actually harms children, and it harms the vulnerable, who then, herd immunity goes down, and vulnerable people who can't get vaccines end up suffering. It's frustrating, obviously, for those of us who believe that there is a common set of critical skills and a common set of evidence.
So we've got a question along these lines from Amy K, who asks, so pastors who ignored the stay-at-home orders and then had deaths within their congregation because they went to church, do you think that those pastors will be more receptive to science instead of prayer after seeing the devastation this pandemic can cause? She says, I'm thinking of Boris Johnson, who was so nonchalant and changed his tune pretty quickly once he got sick himself, which, Dante, I think that's kind of the same thing you're saying. People are going to see the actual harm that being anti-vax can wreak on a society. So what do you think there, Dr. Fiala? On
the one hand, religious psychology is complicated, and people can come up with all kinds of ad hoc rationalizations and explanations to explain away contrary evidence. We know that works that way. It's not just religion, by the way. We all do that all the time. Love works that way. War works that way. So I'm not persuaded that, a couple cases of COVID in a congregation is going to persuade anyone in any direction. But here's the one thing I think that might be useful, and I think it's because I'm interested in also trying to find common ground between science and religion, is that in the heart of Christianity and most of the other religions is a deep concern for caring for the well-being of the vulnerable, the sick, the aged, basic compassion and the golden rule. It might be the case that once congregations start experiencing this directly, that all of that good stuff will kick in, right? And so that people will, there may still be a mythological scheme in the background, but the demands of ethics will be such that, boy, we better do something about this. That's the hope.
Well, Along those same lines, we have another question from M. Kell. Apologies, because I know I butchered that name. Do you have any tips on the best way to cooperate with religious people who deny scientific facts? Do we try to learn to better explain the science? Do you think that's one of the solutions? I mean, it sounds like what you're saying is maybe the better answer is to focus on something like that and appeal to that.
Yeah, I've done a lot of work with interfaith communities, and I'm always the non-religious person there in the room, including at the World Parliament of Religions and other places. What I've learned from those interfaith religious communities is the common ground is often about ethics. It's about caring for people. It's about compassion. The golden rule is a kind of universal principle. And one of the things I think the hardcore scientists, the hardcore sort of humanistic orientation forgets is there's something really useful in religious communities and religious traditions having to do with that kind of ethical focal point. So that's one way to discover common ground, is to say, well, don't you care for children? Don't you care for old people, the handicapped, and so on? The other part is I think, connected to the work you guys do, which has to do with the First Amendment and the religious freedoms. Yeah, and you guys know this history way better than I do, but a lot of those First Amendment cases through the 20th century were minority religious people seeking not to have to pray in school and all the rest of that stuff. It actually was not non-religious people that were pushing the First Amendment. It was more often than not religious people who wanted their own religious liberty to not be violated. So that's another place of common ground, which has to do with religious liberty for everyone, including the non-religious.
Are you concerned at all, just talking about common ground? I know a lot of your other work has been on the ethics, or perhaps lack thereof, of war and about practical pacifism. A lot of the time I see people, in order to sort of try to make common ground, say, oh, this is like a war. It's like fighting a war. You know, the whole country has to rally together. We're fighting COVID-19 like we fought World War II. Do you think that analogy is appropriate, or does it concern you at all?
I wrote another column about this where I said, I argued basically, this is not a war. If anything, it's like an earthquake or a forest fire. It's a natural process, and it's sort of the current pandemic is showing us that we're out of sync with nature. There's this problem of the virus crossing over from animal hosts into the human population and so on. My view is that the war rhetoric is really heavily politicized, and it's connected to claims about China. It's claims about the need to have a wartime president who can, mobilize the troops. And there's been all this other patriotic stuff that goes along with the way we're dealing with the pandemic. People are flying American flags as part of the solidarity in regard to the pandemic. I'm not sure what the American flag has to do with the pandemic. I don't see the connection. And I want us to have solidarity. I want us to cooperate, but I'm worried that the patriotic frame that's associated with war actually gets in the way of that. And just last point on this, the pandemic's global. To have a kind of nationalistic approach to it is completely wrong-headed. And in the future, we're going to have to deal with more and more global crises. It's pandemics, it's climate change, and so on. I'm really worried. Thanks for the question, by the way. I have a lot to say about it. But I'm really worried that we're retreating to a kind of closed nationalism that may be connected to Christian nationalism you were talking about before. And it's not what we need right now. We need globalism instead of nationalism.
So fun fact, just because this popped into my head and because now there's a military jet flying over my house, so I hope you guys can all hear that. The U.S. Army was one of the first to institute vaccines across the Army for smallpox. Washington did. It wasn't technically a vaccine or technically even an inoculation. But anyway, so we actually have a question from FFRF's co-president, Dan Barker, who is writing via email about, he says, and we talked about earthquakes, so this goes in with it. After a lot of disasters, such as the horrific 1755 Lisbon earthquake, many claim that it was God's punishment for rejecting him. This attitude actually increased religious devotion. Could this happen with the current pandemic? Another fun history fact, because again, I'm a nerd, in 1755, there was also a Boston earthquake about 2.5 weeks after the Lisbon earthquake that they blamed on Ben Franklin's lightning rods. That was mostly religious people blaming Franklin's inventions for channeling the electricity into the ground, but also stealing God's thunder quite literally. Anyway, so could this happen with the current pandemic? Could it actually increase religious devotion? Dr. Fiala, you wrote a little bit about that in your article.
Yeah, it could. I mean, who knows? I'm not trying to make light of this comment. There's some data on this that's actually interesting. The Pew Center, they have a regular social science research on religion, and they're the folks who have, for example, tracked the rise of non-religion, which is the fastest growing religion in the United States, which is non-religion. Anyway, a recent report, they say that for religious people, the pandemic has increased their religiosity, or at least not undermined it. Okay. But for non-religious people, it has not driven them back to religion. So I think that what that shows us is that the whether one's religious or not is sort of independent, at least at the moment, independent of the way the world operates, which I think is actually a good thing, because it'd be sort of strange if our deepest commitments had to do with like crises of the moment. Sure. But the truth is that what we're seeing in the social science is that this pandemic's not causing people who are not religious to be more religious. Then throw on top of this, just last comment, which is the importance again of science. I think most of the non-religious people are probably seeing that, well, again, what we need are vaccines and social distancing, and that we need to trust the scientists. And just like in ancient Athens, where people turned to religion initially and then turned away from it, what I would say, to be a little bit provocative, is that the turn to religion is not going to cure this virus. So, maybe give it a little more time. Maybe what we'll find is that as people become more religious, then eventually they realize it doesn't work. We'll see.
So we have a question that sort of piggybacks on that from Tom Reisbeck, who says, do you think that religious companies like Hobby Lobby, I'm going to rephrase that, to companies owned by religious owners, whose CEO had a dream where God told her to keep her company open and made employees basically essential, are also increasing religiosity and anti-science rhetoric? Yeah, it's a little more difficult. I mean, I struggle with this one too, because there's a fiction at the heart of this question that we've all accepted, that we fought against when the Hobby Lobby decision came down, which is that companies are not religious. Companies are a legal fiction that exists only on paper. They exist to protect people who own the companies from legal liability. And while the owners may be religious and they may imbue their company with certain religious quote unquote beliefs or attributes, really the companies themselves aren't. And it's one of the reasons that I found the Hobby Lobby decision so frustrating and such a violation of the rights of Hobby Lobby employees and employees across the country. It allows the owners to use a legal entity to impose their religion on other people, which is, in my book, completely unjustifiable, both under the law and morally. But not quite to Tom's question. Do you want to take a swing at that, Dr. Fiala?
Well, I'm not an expert on the Hobby Lobby case, but it just is part of this ongoing culture war that's driving people apart, really. And And it's just, in my view, okay, you guys are lawyers, so you operate through lawsuits, and we need that. I mean, that's an essential part of our system. We have people's rights get violated, and then they need to go to court. That's true, but we're missing out on the other side of all of this, which is to try to find common ground again. So, I mean, admittedly, Hobby Lobby, I don't know if you could get them in a room with some doctors and some scientists and have the owner of Hobby Lobby have a real conversation or dialogue. To me, that's what we need to be doing. And I'm worried that we're not, because the lawyers are busy doing stuff, the political parties are busy doing stuff, and we're pulling ourselves apart over some of this stuff, when in fact, again, maybe there's some kind of common ground we could find. Who knows?
Well, I think you might have answered our final question from the audience just then, but I'm gonna ask it anyway, just to give you one more chance. So Ann B asks, is there anything we can do to reduce the likelihood of natural disasters increasing religiosity? Which I think you said that's not quite what the evidence suggests. It's that it increases the intensity of some people's religiosity, I guess might be a way to say it, but not across the population.
Well, so here's something worth considering. Something different than what we've already said, which is maybe we need to have better conversations about theology. So back to the point about, does God will this kind of stuff to happen? Does God want us to abdicate our responsibility for, doing things that we know are effective? It might be a good time for all of us to reflect more deeply on theology. What do we think is going on up there in the metaphysical stratosphere? And it turns out, you guys know this, I'm sure too, that often non-religious people and atheists have a better, more subtle understanding of the history of religion. But they're more literate about religion. They may even have a deeper understanding of theology, because part of the problem is, in my view, that people without much education about religion have a very narrow view of religion that's not actually even contained within their own religious traditions. We know that people misunderstand their own traditions. People,
Yes.
People who claim to be Muslims or Christians or whatever haven't even read the primary texts, haven't done their homework. So, this is a typical kind of answer for a professor to make.
No,
but we need more education.
I think that's great, and that more education was going to be my answer as well. And I think it really ties everything together nicely. We talked about the National Day of Reason as a pushback to the National Day of Prayer and the problem with prayer, and to piggyback on to people not reading their foundational texts. In the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 6, verses 5-6, Jesus condemns public prayer as hypocrisy. And yet it's one of the things we have seen constantly, as you highlighted in your article, throughout this pandemic. So it really kind of ties everything together nicely. So Dr. Fiala, thank you so much for taking the time to join us and for writing that great article. I hope everybody goes and reads it.
Great. It was a pleasure to talk with you. Thank you.
Thank you. Dante, thank you for coming on and sharing your awesome victory with us. But that is our show. Ask an Atheist is over for this week. And just a quick promo for our broadcast. The TV show Free Thought Matters. It is available in dozens of markets around the U.S. And this week, which is the last show of the season, to wrap up the year, Dan Barker and Annie Laurie Gaylor interview one of FFRF's favorite people, actress and comedian Julia Sweeney. And this is a clip from the show, and Julia talks about her evolving attitude about one of her most iconic characters from Saturday Night Live.
So I played this character on Saturday Night Live called Pat, who's androgynous. You couldn't tell if Pat was a man or a woman. And the purpose of all the sketches was people feeling uncomfortable about Pat and asking questions, trying to determine if Pat's a man or a woman. And it wasn't until, a few years ago that I realized through my daughter that was not really politically correct. And then I really started thinking about it. And one, that was true. And I was very naive about it. On the other hand, it's like I'm half not apologetic. I don't want to say apologetic, but I'm half understand why people would be uncomfortable now with Pat, because fortunately, most of us have been more enlightened about people's sexuality being more fluid and people not necessarily identifying with male or female under strict cultural guidelines. All of that's fantastic. In fact, that's all the things I love about Pat.
Great clip. And I have to say, I love the word that Julia chose there, enlightened. I really think that that's perfect. We need the ability to grow as a society and as individuals. We need that space to become enlightened. I mean, James Madison opposed a Bill of Rights for a really long time and then ended up becoming the primary proponent, gave us the First Amendment, gave us the Bill of Rights. So anyway, enlightened was a great choice of words there. So you can see Free Thought Matters on TV stations in cities, including New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, Houston, Seattle, many more. Plus the show can be found on both our Facebook and our YouTube channel. So tune in. It really is a fun and educational half hour. Thank you for joining us for Ask an Atheist. Visit us at ffrf.org, and we will be back next Wednesday, noon Central Time, with another episode of FFRF's Ask an Atheist.